Some memories stay quiet. Others don't know how. When Nancy Caldwell wakes in the dead of night, something feels off. Her father is missing. The house is too quiet, and the shadows feel a little too thick. What begins as a search for comfort becomes a descent into something deeper, something older. This is a story about grief, memory, and the things we hold on to, even when we shouldn't. You're listening to the Ambanathy Files. Episode 6, She Used to Be Mother. Welcome to Karl Otto's dark anthology. The whiskey burned comfortably down Calvin Caldwell's throat as he sat slumped in the worn armchair, illuminated only by the dim amber glow of the street lamp filtering through the curtains. The bottle was almost empty. Another night, another attempt to drown out the silence, the unbearable quiet left by a voice he'd never hear again. Nancy was upstairs, he assumed, asleep in her room, but a small noise drew his attention. A soft creak from above, quiet enough to be imagination, loud enough to make his pulse quicken. "Nancy." His voice came out rougher than he meant it to. He cleared his throat, listened carefully. No answer. He rose unsteadily, leaving the bottle on the side table, and moved toward the stairs. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though something pressed down on him, a force made tangible by grief. Halfway up, the wood beneath him groaned deeply, too loudly. The sound echoed through the house. "Nancy," he called again, quieter now, as if fearing an answer. Still nothing. At the landing, he stopped. The hallway stretched further than it should, the darkened corridor elongated into unnatural proportions. Calvin rubbed his eyes and shook his head sharply, trying to dismiss it as fatigue and alcohol. When he opened them again, the hallway was normal, but the air felt thick, almost liquid. A faint whisper drifted from down the hall, a woman's voice, melodic, familiar. His heart seized. "Grace." His throat tightened around her name. His whisper called again, clearer now, beckoning. He moved forward, unable to stop himself. A flicker of movement caught his eye from the open bathroom door. Inside, a soft, warm light glowed. He approached, dread pooling coldly in his stomach. Through the crack, he saw her reflection in the mirror. Grace, seated at her vanity, fingers slowly and gently braiding her hair, movements patient and precise. He reached out, fingertips trembling as he pushed open the door. "Grace." His voice broke. She paused, her fingers suspended mid-braid. Slowly, Grace turned to face him, the gentle smile he remembered perfectly etched on her lips. But as her face fully turned into view, Calvin's breath froze in his lungs. Her features were gone. Smooth, featureless skin stretched over where her eyes and nose, weeping silently from the absence. He stumbled backward, crashing against the opposite wall, shutting his eyes tight against the vision. When he opened them again, he was no longer in the bathroom, but standing in the living room, bright daylight streaming through the windows. A child cried nearby, a young girl, sobbing quietly. Calvin's chest tightened as he turned toward the sound. Nancy sat on the couch, no older than 8, tear-streaked face buried in her small hands. A familiar pain clawed at his heart. "Why are you crying?" His voice felt distant, disconnected. She looked up at him, eyes wide, wet with hurt. "I miss Mommy." He opened his mouth to comfort her, but other words poured out, words he'd spent years trying to forget. "You have to be strong now, Nancy. She died because she was taking care of you. You need to be worth it." Nancy's sobs deepened, and the room blurred violently. Calvin recoiled, ashamed, desperate to erase the memory. He spun around, searching for an escape, but the door behind him was no longer familiar. It was old, cracked paint peeling away in strips. He gripped the knob, twisted, pushed forward. It creaked open slowly to reveal a hallway lined endlessly with mirrors, each reflecting countless versions of Grace. Face blurred, eyes hollow, mouth open in silent screams. Calvin stumbled into the hallway, pulled forward by something deeper than logic, darker than reason. He moved toward the reflections, drawn by an aching, unbearable guilt. As the mirrors stretched endlessly, each grace reached toward him, fingers pressing desperately against the glass. "Stay with me," each whispered softly, "forever." Calvin reached out to touch one of the reflections, the glass impossibly cold against his palm. Then the mirror shattered, and darkness consumed him. Nancy Caldwell jerked awake, heart pounding as though she'd run a mile in her sleep. She stared at the ceiling, the familiar shadows of her room twisted by darkness into unfamiliar shapes. Something had pulled her from sleep, a noise, subtle but wrong enough to disturb her dreams. She sat up, breathing shallowly, listening for it again. Nothing. The house lay quiet, oppressive in its silence. She glanced at the bedside clock, nearly 2 a.m, far too late for her father to still be awake. "Dad?" she called softly, her voice hesitant, almost afraid to disturb the thick stillness. No answer came. A sudden, irrational anxiety fluttered in her chest, forcing her from the warm covers into the chilly air of the hallway. She paused at the top of the stairs, peering down into the darkness below. "Dad?" she called again, louder this time, urgency tightening around her throat. Still nothing. Taking slow, careful steps, Nancy descended into the lower floor. Each creak of the stairs seemed painfully loud, the old wood protesting her movement. When she reached the bottom, a strange sight stopped her cold. The kitchen was a wreck. Cabinets hung open, their contents spilled carelessly across the counters and floor. Silverware lay scattered, glasses overturned, dishes shattered. The sink gushed water, overflowing steadily, pooling across the linoleum tiles. The scene was chaos, stark and unsettling. "Dad?" Her voice shook now, anxiety giving way to a sharper, colder fear. She hurried to turn off the faucet, plunging the kitchen into an abrupt, ringing silence. She stood motionless, heart hammering, as she strained to hear the smallest movement. Nothing but her own frightened breathing filled the void. Then from the corner of her eye, movement flickered across the hallway mirror. Her head snapped toward it. For a split second she saw something else, something dark and indistinct behind her reflection. But it vanished before she could focus. She turned sharply, glancing over her shoulder. Empty. A chill crawled down her spine, dread pooling heavily in her stomach. Something was wrong, far beyond just an untidy kitchen or an empty room. "Dad?" Nancy repeated weakly, though she knew instinctively that no answer would come. Her eyes drifted toward the staircase. On instinct, she moved toward her father's bedroom. Her hand hesitated only briefly on the door before she eased it open. The room was untouched, his bed perfectly made, as though it had never been slept in. She crossed the room slowly, her eyes falling on the closet door, ajar in a way that felt unnatural, beckoning. Swallowing the lump rising in her throat, she reached out, pulling it fully open. Inside, neatly hung, were her mother's clothes. Nancy stared, unable to breathe. Dresses, blouses, even the familiar scarf Grace had loved, all lined up carefully. But these clothes had been donated years ago, after the funeral. They shouldn't be here. They couldn't. Yet here they hung, preserved perfectly, silent and accusing. Beneath them, stacked neatly, were photo albums. Nancy knelt, her knees weak, reaching out to touch the topmost album, newer, darker than the others, unfamiliar. She opened it slowly, the pages revealing glossy photographs of herself, sleeping peacefully, unaware, reading quietly in her room, sitting in the living room watching television. Each image showed a private moment, recent, intimate, and invasive. Her pulse thundered painfully as she flipped through the pages, each photo a fresh violation. She dropped the album as though burned, breath catching in her chest, nausea rising sharply. She stumbled backward, her eyes suddenly locking onto the mirror attached to the inside of the closet door. Her reflection stared back, eyes wide with fear. But as Nancy moved, her reflection remained still, unmoving, a cold detachment settling into its features. Nancy felt her pulse quicken uncontrollably as her reflection slowly lifted a finger to its lips, a silent gesture for quiet, lips curving into a smile that wasn't her own. She bolted from the closet, slamming the door shut, heart nearly bursting from her chest. Fumbling for the hallway phone with trembling fingers, she dialed Peggy's number, barely managing to press the buttons. Peggy's voice, groggy yet instantly alert, came through. "Nancy, what's wrong?" Nancy struggled to steady her voice. "Peg, something's wrong, really wrong. My dad's gone and things are happening in the house. I can't explain it." "I'm coming," Peggy said immediately, any trace of sleep gone. "Stay calm, okay? I'll be right there." Nancy hung up, her breath ragged, hands shaking. She stared down the hallway, the darkness at the end now feeling alive, watchful, malevolent. Her gaze shifted back to the closet door, her pulse quickening as she watched it slowly drift open once more, inch by impossible inch. Within, her mother's dresses swayed gently, as if stirred by an unseen breeze. The mirror's surface rippled faintly, as if touched from within. Nancy held her breath, frozen in dread, as whispers began emanating softly, drifting out from the shadows behind the hanging clothes. "Stay," a voice called gently, a voice that was Grace's, and yet not. "Stay here with me." Nancy pressed herself back against the wall, fear rooting her to the spot, waiting desperately for Peggy's arrival, unsure if she could hold out until then. A sharp knock rattled the front door, jolting Nancy from her anxious vigil. She bolted toward the sound, nearly ripping the door from its hinges in relief as Peggy stood outside, flashlight in one hand, her notebook clutched tightly in the other. "Nancy, are you—" Peggy began, stopping abruptly as she took in Nancy's terrified face. "You look awful. Tell me everything." Nancy swallowed hard, her throat painfully tight. "It's Dad. He's gone, and everything's wrong. I don't know how else to describe it." "Show me," Peggy urged, stepping into the house, the door clicking ominously shut behind her. Nancy led Peggy upstairs in silence, dread settling heavier with every step. At the doorway to Calvin's bedroom, she hesitated, heart pounding painfully. Peggy gently brushed past her, flashlight cutting into the gloom. Peggy stepped into the closet, shining her beam across Grace Caldwell's carefully arranged dresses and blouses. She paused, eyes narrowing. "Your mum's clothes?" she asked softly, confusion plain in her voice. Nancy nodded stiffly. "They shouldn't be here. Dad got rid of them years ago." Peggy bent down, lifting the photo album from the floor. She flipped slowly through its pages, her eyes widening as she took in the carefully snapped pictures of Nancy sleeping, Nancy reading, Nancy unaware she was being watched. "Did your dad take these?" Peggy asked carefully with a calm tone. "I don't know," Nancy whispered, eyes shining with tears. "He's been distant, depressed, I guess. But these photos, it doesn't feel like him. It's like something else is behind it." Peggy closed the album gently, her jaw set firmly. "Then we have to find him." They stepped out of Calvin's bedroom, but Peggy suddenly stopped cold, flashlight beam shaking slightly. "Nancy," Peggy's voice was tight, uncertain. Was the hallway always this long? Nancy's stomach twisted violently. The hallway stretched impossibly far, lined with cracked wallpaper peeling in long, jagged strips. Shadows pooled thickly at the far end, writhing gently, almost alive. "No," Nancy whispered. "This isn't right." Peggy took a slow breath, gripping Nancy's hand firmly. "It's trying to confuse us. Stay close." "Well, it's working," Nancy replied with false bravado. As they moved cautiously forward, soft, indistinct whispers filled the hallway, drifting from the darkened walls. Nancy's pulse quickened painfully as she recognized her parents' voices, blurred and echoing like an old, warped tape. "I don't know if I can do this without you, Grace," Calvin's voice murmured, aching with sorrow. "You must, Calvin," Grace replied softly, lovingly. For her, for Nancy. Nancy's throat tightened painfully, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Peggy squeezed her hand reassuringly, but Nancy felt her own strength wavering beneath the crushing sadness. "Echoes," Peggy whispered urgently, her voice low and steady. "They aren't real. It's the house trying to break us." Nancy nodded numbly, forcing herself forward as Peggy guided her down the hallway toward the staircase. Peggy hesitated sharply at the landing, shining her flashlight downward. Nancy gasped in shock, gripping Peggy's arm tighter. Instead of their familiar staircase descending into the hallway below, an ancient crumbling set of steps plunged steeply downward into darkness. The flashlight beam illuminated faded childish crayon drawings scrawled along the walls. Stick figures, crude houses, smiling suns. Nancy's own artwork from childhood, impossibly replicated here in this strange space. "Peggy," Nancy breathed, panic clawing at her voice. "This isn't our basement." Before Peggy could respond, Nancy saw something at the bottom of the stairs. A familiar figure, slumped, motionless. Her heart lurched painfully. "Dad!" She surged forward without thinking, Peggy stumbling alongside her, barely keeping pace as they rushed downward into the impossible depths. At the bottom, Nancy fell to her knees beside Calvin's slumped form, grabbing his shoulder urgently. But the moment she touched him, Calvin crumbled away beneath her fingers, flesh and bone scattering instantly into a pile of fine grey ash. Nancy shrieked in horror, frantically grabbing at the disintegrating remains, only to have them slip helplessly through her fingers. "No," she sobbed, desperately trying to reform what had been her father. "Dad!" Suddenly the world lurched violently. Nancy's scream was cut short, the darkness around them folding inward. She staggered, vision blurring, breath catching painfully as everything seemed to compress, and then snapped back into place. Nancy blinked rapidly, gasping, her hands clutching Peggy's tightly. They stood exactly where they had moments before, in the hallway outside her father's bedroom. Peggy exhaled sharply, eyes wide, pulse racing. What just happened? Nancy stared blankly at the familiar surroundings, unable to trust her own senses. It reset us. The house. It's playing with us. Peggy steadied herself, anger darkening her expression. It's feeding on fear, Nancy. We have to stay calm. A soft, familiar voice drifted lazily from the shadows down the hallway, gentle and inviting, sending chills rippling over Nancy's skin. "He belongs here now," whispered Grace Caldwell's voice, delicate and heartbreaking. "You can't have him back." Nancy stiffened, fear and grief mingling into sudden anger. Her eyes darkened with stubborn resolve. Peggy tightened her grip, her voice fierce and unwavering. "Like hell we can't." In the shadows ahead, something shifted quietly, eagerly waiting for their next move. Nancy slammed the bedroom door behind them, twisting the lock. It felt like little more than a symbolic gesture, flimsy protection against whatever force lurked within the house. Still, it gave her some fleeting comfort. Peggy set her flashlight down on Calvin's dresser, the beam illuminating a corner of the ceiling, as she flipped rapidly through her dog-eared and worn notebook, eyes scanning the cramped handwriting. "Whatever this thing is," Peggy murmured, voice tight with urgency, "it's anchored here, bound by grief, memory, something powerful enough to keep your father trapped." Nancy stared around her father's bedroom helplessly, heart heavy, breath coming in shaky gasps. The familiar space felt alien now, tainted by secrets, twisted by grief. Her eyes fell to the bedside table, drawn inexplicably to its single drawer. It felt like an itch beneath her skin, demanding attention. She stepped forward, hand trembling slightly as she slid the drawer open. Inside lay a small leather-bound journal she had never seen before. Its cover was worn, soft from frequent handling. Swallowing hard, Nancy flipped it open. Page after frantic page, scrawled in Calvin's familiar handwriting, rushed past her eyes, words ragged with anguish. I hear Grace whisper every night. Her voice feels wrong, not like it was when she was alive. It's her, but not her. Something wearing her skin, her voice. She says she misses me. But why does it feel like drowning? Nancy can never know. I've been watching her, trying to keep her safe. It wants her too. I can feel it watching through my eyes. I don't remember taking these pictures, hiding them away. Why am I doing this? Something's inside my head, something hungry. Nancy's breath hitched painfully, tears blurring the frantic writing. Peggy, she managed weakly. My dad. It's been controlling him. It used his grief, his guilt, to twist him. Peggy gently took the journal from Nancy's trembling hands, skimming quickly. Her face hardened. Then we know what we're fighting against now. We can help him, Nancy. How? Nancy asked, desperation sharpening her voice. How do we fight something that lives in memories? Peggy tapped the open notebook sharply. We do the research. Listen to this. Some demons feed on grief, bound to memories. To free a soul trapped by guilt, burn the anchor, or drown in shadows. Nancy stared blankly. Anchor. Something your father holds on to, Peggy said quickly, eyes scanning the room. Something personal, meaningful. Something belonging to your mom. Nancy's breath caught painfully, her eyes drifting slowly back toward the closet. Swallowing, she moved toward the hanging clothes, pushing through the fabric until she found a small wooden jewelry box tucked safely at the back. With shaking fingers, Nancy lifted the lid. Inside lay a delicate gold wedding band, her mother's ring, polished and lovingly preserved, glittering softly beneath the flashlight's wavering beam. This? Nancy whispered, voice breaking. It has to be this. The room seemed to respond instantly. Cold air rushed around them, plunging the temperature into a biting chill. Shadows in the corners thickened, stretching like fingers toward the circle of their flashlight beam. It knows, Peggy hissed sharply, eyes scanning the darkness. It knows what we're doing. She moved quickly, yanking a small pouch of salt and several candles from her jacket pocket. Kneeling, Peggy began carefully pouring a protective circle onto the bedroom floor, placing candles at intervals around it. Nancy knelt beside her, clutching the wedding ring so tightly it dug painfully into her palm, grounding her amidst the growing chaos. Stay inside the circle, Peggy instructed urgently. Whatever happens, do not break it. Promise me. Nancy nodded numbly, heart pounding. Peggy took a deep breath, opening her notebook, and began to recite softly, the incantation rising steadily, voice unwavering despite the shadows pressing closer. By grief bound, by memory chained, we call upon the light to sever. A scream ripped through the house, ragged and raw, cutting Peggy's voice short. Calvin's voice, distant but agonizingly clear, echoed painfully around them. Dad! Nancy cried, her heart lurching. Peggy, it's hurting him. Peggy's voice shook slightly, eyes flashing with urgency as she continued the chant, words tumbling desperately from her lips. Don't listen, Nancy. It's trying to trick us. Another scream, louder, closer now. Calvin's voice, broken and pleading. Nancy, please, help me. Nancy's resolve fractured instantly. Her father's pain was real, unbearable. She stumbled forward without thinking, her foot dragging across the protective circle, scattering salt across the wooden floorboards. Nancy, don't! Peggy shouted in alarm, reaching out futilely to stop her. But Nancy's mind was already gone. instincts of love and fear overwhelming reason. She ran toward the bedroom door, wedding ring clutched desperately in her shaking fist, ignoring Peggy's frantic cries. The moment her hand touched the knob, the shadows surged inward, flooding the room in suffocating darkness. Peggy's voice was abruptly swallowed, the incantation cut violently short. Nancy yanked open the door, plunging blindly into the corridor, breath catching as a cold, iron-like grip clamped onto her wrist, jerking her brutally into the shadows. The door slammed shut behind her, cutting off Peggy's desperate screams. Nancy stood trapped, trembling in absolute darkness, heart racing wildly, aware only of the terrible, familiar breathing close beside her. "Hello, Nancy," whispered Grace's voice lovingly from the shadows, chillingly sweet and terribly near. "I've been waiting so long to hold you again." Nancy stood motionless, her breath shallow and ragged in the suffocating darkness. The icy fingers that had gripped her wrist slipped away gently, lingering like a lover's caress before withdrawing completely. Then Grace's voice whispered softly from the shadows, achingly gentle, unmistakably familiar. "Oh, Nancy, my sweet girl, I've missed you." Nancy's throat tightened, fear and longing warring painfully inside her chest. "You aren't my mother," she managed, voice shaking. The darkness lifted slowly, just enough to reveal Grace standing close, too close. Her form shimmered, beautifully serene, as perfect as the woman Nancy remembered from childhood. But Grace's eyes, they were empty pits, dark voids reflecting nothing but the absence of life. Grace tilted her head slightly, sadness tugging gently at her lips. "Aren't I? I'm every memory your father ever buried, every regret he couldn't forgive. I'm everything he loved and lost. Isn't that what love is, Nancy? Isn't that why he brought me here?" Nancy recoiled, heart twisting painfully. "No, that isn't love." Grace's hollow eyes softened slightly, reaching toward Nancy as if longing for embrace. "Stay with us. Your father's home now, safe with me. We can be whole again." Behind the locked bedroom door, Peggy slammed her shoulder desperately against the wood, pain flaring in her bones as the door refused to budge. Her breath came harsh and fast, panic rising like bile in her throat, voice shaking as she forced herself to continue the incantation. "Where demons feed on grief, lie with bound memories and flame unchained. Banish this pretender," Peggy shouted, each word stronger, clearer. The house around her groaned angrily, shadows surging violently against the protective circle, candle flames guttering weakly beneath their assault. "Let me in!" Peggy screamed in rage and frustration, slamming once more against the door, her determination fueling her strength. In the shadowed heart of the house, Grace gently led Nancy forward, deeper into a distorted chamber. A twisted reflection of her father's study, familiar yet corrupted. Nancy froze, breath hitching painfully in her chest as she saw her father clearly now, slumped in a chair, chains of shifting shadows wrapped cruelly around him. "Dad!" she cried desperately, rushing forward. Calvin looked up, eyes glazed with exhaustion, haunted by unimaginable guilt. He flinched, pulling weakly away. "Nancy, no, you shouldn't have come here," he rasped, voice ragged and hollow. "She wants you too. You have to get out." Nancy reached toward him helplessly, tears spilling down her face. "I'm not leaving you." Grace's gentle facade flickered slightly, eyes darkening further as her voice sharpened subtly. "He belongs here, Nancy. I gave him peace. Let him rest." Nancy shook her head fiercely. "This isn't rest. It's torture. Let him go." Calvin stirred, clarity flickering briefly in his hollow eyes. "Nancy," he whispered, voice breaking. "It's too late for me. She's too strong. Run." Behind them, the door burst inward suddenly. As Peggy appeared through it, holding the notebook high, her face fiercely determined. Grace twisted sharply toward Peggy, her lovely mask fracturing, shadows surging violently outward, attempting to drive Peggy back. Peggy shouted the incantation defiantly, words strong, unyielding, battling the darkness with every syllable. "Nancy, the ring! Burn it! It's the anchor! Do it now!" Nancy clenched the wedding ring tightly, heart wrenching violently in her chest. Calvin's weary eyes met hers, begging quietly, "Do it, Nancy." Grace turned swiftly back toward Nancy, eyes shifting rapidly from sorrowful pleading to desperate rage. "If you destroy it, you lose him forever. You'll lose everything." "That's not your mother, Nancy," Peggy barked. "She's lying to you." Nancy stood paralyzed, heart breaking, her father's quiet pleas and Grace's emotional manipulations colliding painfully inside her. Her vision blurred, tears flooding unchecked down her cheeks, choking on grief and desperation. "I'm sorry, Dad," she whispered brokenly, lifting the wedding ring toward the flickering candlelight. Her hand trembled violently as she prepared to throw it into the flame, Peggy's voice echoing fiercely in her ears, Grace's desperate shriek piercing the shadows. Then, without warning, Grace lunged forward, face contorting hideously, a monstrous mask of grief and rage. Her shadowed hands shot toward Nancy's throat with terrifying speed. Nancy gasped sharply, stumbling backward, her grip loosening momentarily as she crashed heavily onto the floor. The ring rolled from her fingers, skittering toward Grace's feet. Peggy screamed Nancy's name, lunging forward desperately, notebook slipping from her grip. Calvin twisted sharply in his chains, voice raw and pleading. "Nancy!" Nancy watched in horror as Grace slowly bent down, her form shifting disturbingly between monstrous and maternal, picking up the ring delicately. Grace's hollow gaze returned to Nancy, sorrowful and satisfied. "Now you'll never leave us." The shadows surged violently inward, swallowing everything in absolute darkness. Cut sharply to black. Darkness pressed in from every side, swallowing Nancy, suffocating her in its cold embrace. Grace stood tall, the wedding ring held delicately between shadowed fingertips, her hollow eyes fixed lovingly, possessively upon Nancy. "You belong here now," Grace murmured gently, her voice resonant, melodic, horribly comforting. "You'll be mine, forever." Nancy scrambled backward, breath hitching painfully in her chest. Behind her, Peggy staggered upright, notebook clutched tightly, her flashlight flickering erratically, barely holding back the encroaching darkness. "Don't listen, Nancy," Peggy shouted desperately. "It's not your mother, it's just pain, just grief." Grace's form shuddered, twisting violently into monstrous shapes, her voice distorting sharply. "Silence!" Shadows lashed outward, knocking Peggy backward into the wall, the notebook skittering from her fingers. Peggy groaned, slumping heavily to the floor, momentarily stunned. Nancy turned back sharply to Grace, her heart breaking, tears blurring her vision. "You're hurting him," she whispered. "You're hurting us all. Let him go." Grace's shifting visage rippled gently, sorrow flickering briefly across her monstrous features. "He asked me to stay, to take the pain away." A broken, raw voice cut through the darkness behind them, Calvin's voice, weak but clear. "I was wrong." Nancy spun around. Her father strained weakly against the shadowy chains, eyes suddenly clear, pain etched deeply in every line of his face. "I thought I needed her," Calvin rasped, his gaze holding Nancy's fiercely. "But it wasn't her, was it? I know that now. Nancy, I'm so sorry." Grace hissed angrily, shadows tightening violently around Calvin's throat, silencing him abruptly. "Stop it!" Nancy screamed, rage finally overwhelming her fear. "You're not her. You're poison." Grace lunged forward, hand stretched desperately toward Nancy, ring glinting sharply in the wavering candlelight. Peggy struggled to her feet, blood trickling down her temple, snatching the notebook from the floor, voice hoarse but defiant as she resumed chanting the incantation, each word a fierce challenge to the house's power. The shadows recoiled slightly, shrieking and writhing, pulling Grace back with them. Nancy seized the chance, scrambling forward and reaching desperately for Grace's outstretched hand, grasping for the ring. Her fingers closed around the cold gold band, pulling with all her might. Grace twisted violently, face contorted with rage, shadows enveloping Nancy painfully. But Nancy held firm, crying out as she wrenched the ring free. Peggy's chanting rose louder, fiercer, words echoing powerfully through the distorted room. Where demons feed on grief, lie with bound memories, and flame unchained. Banish this pretender. Nancy stumbled toward the guttering candle. Grace's enraged screams piercing her ears. Calvin's desperate eyes fixed pleadingly upon her. With one last surge of determination, she flung the ring into the flame. For a heartbeat, the ring hung suspended, the shadows frozen, Grace's screams silenced. Then it dropped into the candle's fire. A burst of brilliant white flame exploded upward, filling the room with searing, blinding light. Nancy threw her arms up, shielding her face as shadows howled around her, the house itself groaning violently, walls trembling, foundations shuddering as if in agony. As quickly as it had begun, the light vanished, leaving only stillness and quiet darkness. Nancy dropped to her knees, gasping painfully, eyes searching desperately in the darkness. "Dad?" Silence answered her. Peggy's flashlight flickered weakly, barely illuminating the room. She crawled toward Nancy, gripping her friend's hand tightly. "It worked, I think." Nancy shook her head, trembling. "No. Where is he?" Slowly, painfully, Calvin's form emerged from the gloom, sprawled limply upon the floor, unmoving. Nancy crawled frantically toward him, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Dad!" She lifted his head gently, panic rising at his utter stillness. "Please, don't leave me." Peggy knelt beside her, checking Calvin's pulse. Her eyes widened. "Nancy, he's breathing. Barely, but he's alive." Nancy sobbed in relief, hugging Calvin close, her body shaking uncontrollably. Peggy glanced around uneasily, tension still etched deeply in her expression. "We need to get him out of here." Nancy nodded weakly, gathering her strength. As they moved to lift Calvin, the house trembled violently beneath their feet, wood splintering, shadows surging fiercely back into life. "No," Nancy whispered desperately. "It's still here." The bedroom door slammed violently open, splinters flying as an unseen force seized Peggy and Nancy, hurling them bodily from the room. They crashed into the hallway, tumbling painfully down the staircase. "Dad!" Nancy screamed, struggling to her feet, desperate to reach her father again. But before she could move, a cold, relentless gust rushed forward. The front door crashed open ahead of them, pushing them out into the cold night air and moonlight. "No!" Nancy's voice broke as they stumbled helplessly out onto the lawn, the snow-covered yard soaking through their clothes. She spun around instantly, lunging back toward the house. But the door slammed shut violently, sealing itself tight. Windows darkened one by one, blinds snapping shut like closed eyelids. The entire house seemed to shudder, settling into a grim stillness. A voice drifted from the cracks around the doorframe, gentle yet coldly triumphant. Grace's voice. "Calvin is mine now. Soon enough, you will be too." Nancy pounded desperately against the sealed door, tears streaming down her face. Peggy pulled her close, holding her tightly as the shadows deepened around the house, and the last light flickered out, plunging it into absolute consuming darkness. You've made it out, but not everyone did. If the Caldwell house stirred something in you, a chill, a tear, a shadow that still lingers, then you belong here, with us. Subscribe for new stories every week. Full Anthology drops monthly. Next issue, May 2025. Share it with someone who still believes the dead should stay dead. And remember, stay curious, stay terrified.